Palestinians have been brutalised, made homeless, starved or injured. So that's why we're here today. But as you've seen from the film, part of the strategy of the people who are doing these crimes is that they don't want to have their crimes announced or publicised or spread around, and therefore censorship is a crucial issue for us, and that's why we put the film on tonight. We've got two excellent speakers tonight. On my right, we've got Granville Williams. I'll just introduce Granville and then I'll let him speak. So Granville is from an organisation called Media North. It's part of the campaign for press and broadcasting freedom. He's an expert and an activist for very many years on the issue of the terrible state of the British press. And he's going to speak for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, yeah. And then we're going to take our second speaker, who is an equally excellent activist, Neelam Hussain, who is part of the Palestine Blackburn group. She's an activist, she's an expert in what's going on locally, and therefore we'll take Neelam. And then at the end of that, we'll take questions and answers for both the speakers. Is that all right? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, John. Actually, can you hear me? Do I need to use a microphone?
No.
I'm okay? Right. Thanks, John. I've given this talk before in Stockport.
Sorry, excuse me. My partner, he would need the microphone.
Okay, fine,
yeah.
fair enough. Right.
Thank you.
Is it? Okay, good. So, Media North, timely, this issue just come off the press today. New report reveals BBC bias against Palestinians. I'll talk about it later. If you'd like to buy a copy, they're on the stall up there. Cheap for £1, cheap as chips for £1. Okay, now, over the last 20 months, around the world, we've seen the images of the devastation, the murder, the destruction going on in Gaza. But Israelis won't see that. The Israelis live in a closed media, and the images that we have seen, they don't see. Why is that? Well, first of all, the Israeli media is militaristic, it's absolutely propagandist, but also, because of the power of Netanyahu, he actually has changed the structures of the media in Israel. So that, for example, the Likud party took over a channel, it was a heritage channel, called Channel 14. And they made it the equivalent of a Fox News. So in other words, it's the most widely watched channel in Israel. And that pumps out propaganda. But there are other aspects as well to the way in which the media operates to prevent any kind of access to the images. There are two exceptions, by the way, Haaretz and a small online network called, I've checked the title of it, it's called Plus 972. And Plus 972 and Haaretz try to give some kind of alternative image to Israel, but they're marginal and they're not effective. So that's one point. But secondly, channels like Channel 14 play an active role in dehumanising the Palestinians. And that's to the extent that when the South African evidence was presented to get the verdict of genocide, Channel 14 was cited as part of that evidence. So we're talking about extremely nasty kind of media. Two other points I've made. Israeli law requires journalists, if they're writing about security, to put their programs have to be vetted by the military. So it's incredible. So in other words, when the online channel I mentioned used freedom of information, this is in 2023, the Israeli military censor barred the publication of 613 articles dealing with national security. So in other words, that's another filter, if you want, that blocks any kind of information getting out to Israelis. And of course, you've also got to remember that Al Jazeera, which is presented relentlessly within Israel as a propagandist pro-Hamas channel, it isn't. It's actually a very high quality, accurate broadcaster. Its journalists have been killed in Gaza trying to get the truth out. In 2 stages, Israel banned it. First of all, it shut down Al Jazeera in Israel, so that physically they couldn't operate there. But then they also closed up the operation of Al Jazeera in the West Bank. So it's virtually silenced. So that's one aspect in terms of censorship of the media. The Israelis themselves, it's interesting, you will have seen in the last day or two the appalling outrage that's gone on over the last week or two, certainly since June actually, when the distribution of aid within Gaza was presented to an organisation run by American and Israeli. And we've seen people deliberately shot as they've gone to these aid centres. And we see that regularly, every day that happens. If you look at the response of the Israeli spokespeople, it's always to deny it. So that's the problem, really, that we face there. Within Gaza, first of all, the international media are blocked. They don't go in. You can only go in if you agree to the terms of the Israeli Defence Force. In other words, you see only what they want you to see. There's been massive protest internationally by journalists. They've ignored it. They won't change the rules. But also, we have seen, and this is incredible, it's the worst death toll for journalists. Over 200 journalists have been murdered, and we have to use that word. They've been targeted and murdered in Gaza. And only yesterday, we saw another victim, and there was a short item on Channel 4 News last night presenting this. It's really, I want to give 1 or 2 examples just to demonstrate the way the technique. You'll remember there was a story presented of about 14 or 15 medical workers driving, and they were murdered, they were shot, and their vehicles were buried. In other words, literally, the Israelis committed murder and buried the evidence, except, of course, there was a phone in which somebody had recorded the images as he was dying. And when it was actually persistently raised with the Israelis, in the end they acknowledged and suggested, quote, it was a rogue unit. Most of the destruction done by the Israeli Defence Force, they will always deny what is clear evidence, so that if it's a targeting of a hospital, they will say, no, that's Hamas is in there, that's why we've done it. So in other words, the ways in which the Israelis seek to shift off any responsibility for the destruction in Gaza, it's quite terrifying, because there's actually silence. I'll come on to that in a minute, but one of the other examples, which seems to me to be terrifying at the moment, is, as I say, the way in which they deny the systematic use by the Israeli Defence Force to target and shoot people as they rush to get food. So we're having people who are starving to death in Gaza, desperate to get food, and if they break the rules and don't go along a certain route, that's a legitimate target to shoot, and that's what's happening. It's terrifying stuff. Where's the outrage in the media? Where's the outrage in our media? There's very little. I just want to talk a little bit about the BBC, well, the UK first of all. First of all, I mean, the right-wing press in the UK does not deal with Gaza in any balanced way. It's silence. It's absolutely pro-Israeli. I think Channel 4 News is giving good coverage. I think sometimes there are problems with it, but I think a lot of the good, harder interviews have been done, and I think it's sought to give some kind of balanced perspective there. It's the BBC that's the problem. We saw that in the film. The documentary How to Survive a War Zone, you'll remember about the 3 Gazan children talking about the way they were living. That, of course, was pulled, not by a mass protest. The actual number was 44 people complained to the BBC and said this should be pulled. And guess what? It was taken off iPlayer. It did not mention over 1,000 Jewish people actually said the film should be kept on and it should still be shown. So there's one example. Secondly, oh, by the way, I need to compare that. Channel 4, it put on a joint production by Israeli and Palestinian filmmakers, No Other Land. Very, very good. I don't know if you saw it, you probably could still. So at least these programmes can be shown, but the BBC has feared for it. Now, the latest example is this one about the Gaza medics, which has been pulled by the BBC. It was commissioned Basement Films to make it. And the guy who runs Basement Films, Ben De Beer, did originally work for Channel 4, and then he moved over to run this independent filmmaker. I'll quote what he says. Our argument all along has been to tell the story of the doctors and medics in Gaza as soon as possible. People whom we convinced to talk to us despite their own reservations that the BBC would never ever tell their stories. So he went out of his way to actually get those interviews. Now the BBC, the problem is the BBC is not going to show the film. It's not going to show it, but it still owns it. And there's a problem, therefore, about Basement Films even being able to show the film that they've made. Now, I want to finish by talking about the Centre for Media Monitoring report, because it's incredible. First of all, the Centre for Media Monitoring has done 3 reports. The first one it did was on Gaza. The second one was looking at GB News and the way it reported. And this is the third one. And I think it's so important. We need to spread the word about it. The problem is, this report came out and there's been zilch in the mainstream media about it. Andrea Catherwood, who does the BBC feedback programme, again, it's a BBC feedback programme, but it's made by an independent. And in the last week's episode, a lot of people protested about BBC reporting on Gaza. And she made a commitment that she was going to get somebody from the BBC to respond to this report. Because the important bit, I think there's 2 or 3 bits that need to be mentioned. First of all, it's a massive, it covers 32,000 broadcast segments from 7th of October 23 to October 24. So it's a massive, this is not just looking selectively, it's going right the way through the whole range of the BBC output. And it found that the BBC used emotive terms 4 times as much for Israeli, the light is funny here, 4 times as much for Israeli victims and applied massacre 18 times more to Israeli casualties than Palestinians. It also, and this is I think is very important, the study also found that the BBC had interviewed significantly more Israelis, 2,350, than Palestinians, just 1,000. And TV and national BBC presenters shared the Israeli perspective. In other words, so when they were interviewing, they started from an Israeli perspective when they were interviewing, rather than the Palestinian perspective. 2,340 to 270. So we're talking about a report which is massively important, and it confirms what we've been arguing over the months about the BBC coverage. Just one last point. I do urge you, you should protest to the BBC. The reason Andrea Catherwood on feedback responded is because a number of people who were very knowledgeable about the media coverage of the carnage in Gaza, she was respectful to them, she let them speak, and I think she was persuaded by it. So what I'm saying to you is that you shouldn't, if you see something on the BBC, you should complain, but you need to be recognising that they're likely to just ignore it, but you've still got to make the protest, because the BBC should be working for us, it should be reporting for us, not for a very narrow perspective which actually is pro-Israeli in its emphasis. And finally, just want to mention a couple of points. One of the key directors, one of the people who is on the board, the BBC board, is a man called Ronnie Gibb. Now, Ronnie Gibb, for a while, was a key figure with the Jewish Chronicle, and he's a very powerful figure in the BBC. He's worked, by the way, for the BBC in its news area, and I'm their NUJ, National Union Journalists member. And I have spoken to people who worked with Gibb. When he worked at the BBC, he was trying to push the whole emphasis, the bias of the BBC towards the right. And then he moved to be, guess what, head of communications for Theresa May, and then he's moved on now. He's now in his second term as a BBC non-executive director, and I think he plays a very insidious backdoor role in influencing the way in which journalists operate. I should say, by the way, my union, at its delegate meeting, there was a really fierce discussion about the BBC and impartiality. And many of the journalists got very angry, even to the point, I think, that some of them were thinking of leaving the NUJ because the issue of impartiality was raised. There's a real battle between those people in the BBC who think there is a problem with the way the BBC is reporting it, and those who think the BBC is doing it right. I just want to quote one last finish here. I'm winding up now. It's from a BBC newsreader who resigned. And she said, I was at the BBC for 5 years, starting out as a researcher and eventually becoming a newsreader and journalist. And she then says, it created the biggest rift between my commitment to truth and the role I had to play as a BBC journalist in the way she had to start. She was in overlords, if you want, insisted she told the story. So she resigned from the BBC. So finally, and I'm going to finish on this, as I say, over the last 20 months, we've seen the abject failure of politicians to condemn Benjamin Netanyahu's genocidal actions in Gaza and move towards punitive measures against it. We've still seen no action at all on what was a decisive verdict when we said there was an issue of genocide as a result of the International Criminal Court. So there's a big battle, and the media, I'm afraid, has not helped us in terms of aiding us in that battle. Thank you very much.